Hello, everybody. This is a brief introduction to sociology, the discipline, the topic, the way of thinking about the world. Basically, when we talk about sociology, we're talking about the study of how people act in groups, sometimes in interaction, and sometimes in very large. So it's essentially a task about seeing the strange and the familiar. Assumptions about behavior that seem biological or psychological often have other sources. We've discussed why people commit suicide, for example, in our early example. When you choose an intimate partner, or what you decide to study, all have to do very much with our social world, how we live, how we comport ourselves, and how we interact in an environment where the social world, as much as nature, in fact, acts upon us. So basically, we're talking two levels and three paradigms from which we begin to study the social world. Macro versus micro are the levels, and the paradigms are large kind of ways of patterned analysis of our social world, include structural functional, a macro level analysis, conflict, a macro level analysis, and symbolic interactional, which is a micro level. So the structural functional paradigm is macro level. That means it looks, just as the word macro suggests, it looks at the world on a very large. We examine how society stabilizes itself. What's a structure, for example? We need to clarify that before we move on. It's a large-scale way in which humans meet shared needs. That is, health, education, maintaining order, providing for the public defense. And a function is what are the processes that meet these structural needs. That's what a function is. The conflict paradigm, on the other hand, also known as a critical paradigm, is also a macro-level analysis. It also addresses social structure. But it begins from the assumption that social structures are arranged in such a manner that there are inherent inequalities, the result of structural arrangements that advantage some groups at the expense of others. Resource allocation is inherently unequal. Symbolic interaction and exchange theory, another variant of everyday interactional analysis, begins from the micro level, from the level of everyday interaction. In this paradigm, meaning is created from the ground up, that is, from exchanges between people and small groups. Use of symbolic systems creates meaning, and from meaning, large-scale social structures are created. Language is the primary symbolic system, although anything that we assign meaning to is key. Money, flags, all of those things are symbolic. So how do we analyze? Let's look at deductive versus inductive reasoning. Social science research methods begin with identifying a perspective in terms of where we're going to begin our reasoning. Now, in social scientific analysis, deductive reasoning moves from generalized principles to a specific conclusion. Theory testing using hypotheses. We look at macro level data. Again, structural, functional, or conflict level analyses typically begin using this deductive approach. What are the elements? A hypothesis test. We know from your observations, for example, that we discussed in class, and other people have discussed, that there are more parking problems at 10 a.m. than at 7:30 a.m. So from there, we can develop a hypothesis. There are fewer parking places at 10 a.m. than 7:30 a.m. This tests a general theory or a generalized principle that we've formed in our mind of parking social structure at its most simple level. So we go and we measure it. It has to be able to be disproven, in other words. The alternative hypothesis would be that parking is the same at 10 a.m. as it is at 7:30. Macro level data is used. Structural, functional, and conflict theories, again, use this approach because we're looking at large scale patterns in society, and so we're drawing on large sources of data. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, is theory building. We move from specific observations made repeatedly to a general theory. There is no hypothesis testing here. It's used in sociology and cultural anthropology and sometimes social psychology at the micro level. We can look at a situation that we don't have much knowledge of. We look for patterns in specific observations, and from there, we can begin to build a theory. So what are our methods for testing or building theories, for analyzing data, for grounding our theory in some sort of observable reality? Well, the first technique or tool that is used by social science researchers is a survey. Survey research methods are used to collect original data when we perhaps design our own survey and administer it. Often, that's cost prohibitive. So we use secondary data collected by others. Department of Justice data, Uniform Crime Report, the Census Bureau, the Pew Trust as a data source. We'll be looking at all those. The experimental method can be used for hypothesis testing. We can't really do this very effectively in large-scale social science approaches. Where this comes in is what we call a quasi-experiment, right? For example, if I wanted to test the effectiveness of a reading program, I would test the people who are going to be exposed to that reading program before, get a score, introduce them to the reading program, and then test their scores afterward. If the differences between the two sets of scores were significantly different, we would know that our reading program had some degree of success. Sometimes when we don't know about a social situation, we don't have large-scale data, we want to learn more. We do some exploratory research. We do direct observation. This is an inductive approach. It's grounded in the symbolic school that we talked about a moment ago. I would go, for example, if I wanted to know how people in a religious community organize themselves, I would go observe them. I would, over a long period of time, I would take field notes, I would make assessments of the field notes, and I would see whether there were any repeated behaviors that went on and make note of those over an extended period of time. Sometimes we can do interviews online, a lot of open-ended interviews where we ask people, where we have a one-on-one conversation with. Finally, sometimes we do what is called a content. We are materially generating creatures, human beings. We write books, we do recordings. If I wanted to know, for example, about books, whether there was a theme that was introduced in a series of books, I would read them and analyze their content. So we did this in-class thought exercise, and I want you to think for a minute about these statements. Which are testable hypotheses and which are not? We'll be starting and expanding on these as we move through class, through the material in our upcoming weeks too. Take care.